This program was made possible in part with generous support from Meshua Farm Foundation, Ohio Humanities, the Annis Family Charitable Fund, Alan B. Lindner Family Fund, Cincinnati Museum Center, Camden Foundation, the Nature Conservancy in Ohio, with additional support from these generous donors. Thank you. "100 years ago, a young woman from Cincinnati set out to explore the region's natural environment. 50 years later, she'd be recognized as one of the most influential botanists and ecologists in the country. Struggling against the odds, she worked to preserve the natural heritage and ecological integrity of the primeval forests of eastern North America. Challenged, she didn't give up. With her sister Annette as colleague and companion, Lucy Brown devoted her life to science and the preservation effort. Though hidden in the shadows of history, she was a force for nature whose impact remains.
Lucy Brown is a world-famous plant ecologist, and she actually came from the Cincinnati area, studied here, and then traveled all through eastern North America way back when, early in the 1900s, studying plant communities. She not only knew about botany, she knew about geology. She and her sister traveled up and down mountains, up and down all sorts of natural areas, describing what they saw in detail, in good scientific detail.
Any major paper about the eastern deciduous forest starts with the citation Brown. 65,000 miles of effort, travel, and study in the Appalachians.
She was extremely intelligent. She didn't have to stop and think. The names and the places just rolled off of her tongue.
Little old lady in tennis shoes, she was not. She was a scientist, and she was an incredible individual, but no nonsense.
She kind of commanded. She was a commander. She reminds me of what Patton would have sounded like. But instead of tanks, she was controlling us, the botanists, wannabes.
Lucy Brown is the premier ecologist in the region. She's someone who highlighted the biodiversity that occurred in the forest of Kentucky and Ohio. And she's someone who worked really hard to create conservation in the area.
She was a force to be reckoned with in the world of science. And she was not intimidated by the male culture which dominated the time that the two sisters were doing their work.
And she truly was a pioneer, and she became recognized nationally as one of the foremost ecologists and botanists in the United States.
The woodlands around Cincinnati are a fertile environment for diverse plants, rocks, animals, and insects. Even more so at the turn of the 20th century, when Lucy was a child. It was the perfect setting for curiosity and wonder in nature to grow.
I was born in Cincinnati in 1889 and received all my education in the Cincinnati schools. My father was a principal here, and both he and my mother were always interested in nature.
George Frederick Brown was born in Cincinnati to German immigrants and became a medical doctor and public school principal. When he married Emma Wright, an elementary school teacher, she quit teaching to raise a family. The couple's first daughter, Annette Francis, was born on August 28, 1884. Emma Lucy followed 5 years later, on April 19, 1889. The influence of two disciplined educator parents had a profound impact on Lucy.
That German heritage and Victorian heritage came through her whole demeanor then. She lived with her parents, especially her mother after her father passed away, until she was over 40 years old, she and her sister Annette.
Lucy and Annette were raised according to their parents' strict conservative values. One anecdote illustrates the point. Past the age of 30 and already a respected entomologist, Annette received a professional visit from a noted microlepidopterist. George Brown told him, "You can have 1 hour with my daughter." Then he sat on a chair outside the parlor during the entire visit. The family lived in Mother Brown's childhood home in Walnut Hills, an early hilltop suburb of Cincinnati. Emma Wright Brown brought her experience as a teacher and her own love of nature to the family's home life. Under her direction, the family kept a small herbarium, a collection of dried pressed plants. Mother Brown's interests in botany were part of a long tradition of women in the natural sciences.
Some of the first books and lectures about botany in the United States were actually written by women. And botany was associated with women because women had this connection with gardening, with agriculture, with food, with medicinal herbs, and with the aesthetics of flowers. But as botany became professionalized, along with all the other sciences in the late 1800s, then women were left out of the academic or professional associations of botany.
Following their parents' interests, both girls developed passion for the natural sciences, broadening their study at home and school with nature camps and other outdoor activities.
Their mother was very keen on getting them out into nature, which was very much in vogue around the turn of the century. There was a very prominent nature study movement in the United States in which the thinking was that children should be exposed to nature, that they should be taken out of the classroom at a very early age.
Despite the cultural trend toward women in botany, Annette, at age 14, focused her interest toward insects instead of plants. Within a few years, she narrowed her study to Lepidoptera, the order of insects that includes moths and butterflies, then focused further on Microlepidoptera, tiny leaf miner moths.
She was responsible for the ID of somewhere in that neighborhood, 375 species of microlept. She was the world authority, I mean, absolutely the world authority. And in ways, she's clearly scientifically matched Lucy's successes, but in her own quiet way.
Annette began study at the University of Cincinnati in 1902, and Lucy followed in 1906. Unlike many universities, the University of Cincinnati accepted women from its start in 1873. Botany classes were a popular area of study for female students, and Lucy reveled in the dynamic academic environment. An important faculty member in the biology department, Harris M. Benedict, became one of her advisors.
He started what was called the Blue Hydra Society. Students got so enthralled and enthused about just biology in general. It started, then it morphed into plants, that they joined the society. So Lucy was one of the early members, and Annette as well.
It wasn't all science, however. Lucy picked up other valuable skills at UC, including photography. She'd use it to document botanical studies throughout her life. After completing her bachelor's and master's degrees, Annette became the first woman ever to receive a PhD at the University of Cincinnati in 1911. Lucy pursued her interest in geology to a master's degree, then switched her focus to botany. In 1914, she followed in her sister's footsteps and became the second woman in the sciences and the third woman in any discipline to earn a PhD at the University of Cincinnati.
They're going to school in an era when many more women are getting degrees from the University of Cincinnati and from other institutions like the University of Cincinnati, but they're not necessarily advanced degrees. So what's unusual with the Brown sisters is that they continue on and get the PhD.
Lucy's thesis on the physiographic ecology of the Cincinnati region brought together her expertise in the disciplines of geology and botany and demonstrated early exploration in the emerging field of ecology.
When Brown graduated with her PhD from Cincinnati, she couldn't get a degree in ecology. There was no field of study for it.
Plant ecology has many different definitions, but I like to think of it as the relationship between plants and their environment and how they also influence each other. So rather than just focusing on plants in general or animals in general or geology or environmental studies, it's the whole thing together. And so it's how these different organisms relate to each other.
One of the things that Lucy Brown did, which was unique for her time, is that she looked at how vegetation changed. So she looked in the Cincinnati area and compared the vegetation at the current time to how it was earlier. And this was one of the first times this had been done and was used as a framework for other studies that went back and looked at plants through time.
Dr. Brown, when she's in the field, she's not just walking around. She's thinking, and she's looking at plant communities. What are the relationships between this plant and another plant, and the soil they grow in, and the amount of light, and the amount of moisture, and the changing climate? This is all stuff that was going on for the first time, this kind of thinking. I mean, today we take it for granted.
In the introduction to her dissertation, Lucy credits H.M. Benedict, her mentor at UC, and Henry Chandler Coles from the University of Chicago as advisors on her work. Coles is one of the pioneers of ecology in the U.S.
Henry Chandler Coles was very important in the development of particularly plant ecology. And he loved teaching outside. He packed up these vast touring cars and off they went to the Rocky Mountains, down to the swamps in Florida, etc.
Normally at this time, you have to remember that female students typically weren't allowed to do the same things that the male students were doing. And so although Lucy wasn't officially a student of his, we're finding evidence that she went on several of these different trips. That was one part of her early education, I think, that really shaped her ideas later on. And so he was really instrumental in that.
A common problem for women earning PhDs in the sciences was what to do next.
The traditional track for a man in the sciences who received a PhD would be in university research and teaching, and there just weren't as many university positions for women scientists.
Annette taught at UC, but only for a short time.
What we see over time is essentially a role reversal where the older sister, who you would think would be running the show and taking care of everything, actually sort of stepped back, and then Lucy stepped up as the breadwinner.
Lucy went to the university. Annette managed the house, did her research, and accompanied Lucy on every expedition that Lucy ever made.
Annette still was pretty productive. I mean, she still continued her work, but at home. You know, they lived together their whole life. They took care of one another. It was a very close relationship.
E. Lucy Brown became a faculty member at the University of Cincinnati immediately following completion of her doctorate in 1914. She would continue teaching for 34 years. By all accounts, she was a dedicated and engaging teacher. Jody Howison took a class from E. Lucy in 1948.
I had taken it because it, related to geography, which I was majoring in. And I really loved it. In fact, she was so good and I enjoyed it so much that I periodically used to think that if I'd taken it earlier, I might have switched my major to botany instead of geography.
She'd expect a lot of you as a student, but her students would bend over backwards, to help her out, to be with her, to follow her around and learn from her.
Bob Henn was a graduate student at Miami University when he took a couple of field trips with E. Lucy.
Fabulous woman, just a personality that radiates when you first meet her. She was petite, you might say, wore her hair pulled back in a bun. She looked like she had hand-me-downs from World War I Army units. She had the lace-up boots and the sort of a jobber type of pants, you know, that fit down inside the boots and they ballooned a little bit above her knee. As a teacher, she wanted us to experience the plants. She would say, no, squeeze those leaves, crush up a leaf and smell it. What does that smell like to you?
Lucy's involvement with a new scientific organization in 1915 put her on the map as one of the country's earliest professional ecologists. The Ecological Society of America was formed to further the goals of the emerging science. At age 28, E. Lucy Brown was one of the new organization's 284 charter members. Only 21 of them were women. Today, the ESA is the world's most important ecological organization, with over 10,000 members.
The American Ecological Society has become the most important society of professional ecologists in the world because it's the one that has impact in terms of major issues that we're facing today.
The development of ecological thought and the beginnings of the ESA coincided with a broader cultural interest in conservation.
The economy had been growing like gangbusters in the late 19th century, industrializing, running through natural resources at a remarkable clip. As a scientist, if you think what you'd really like to understand is how do all these plants and animals interact in a natural way without human beings being present, then you will automatically think about the value of wilderness.
Lucy quickly became involved in conservation efforts as a member of the ESA's Committee for the Preservation of Natural Conditions, chaired by the organization's first president, Victor Shelford. The committee published The Naturalist's Guide to the Americas in 1926, a catalog that documented known patches of wilderness and espoused preservation. Lucy wrote sections about Ohio and the national parks.
That, of course, led to her interest in conservation because she was going to these places, seeing them changing. And so that sort of prompted in her a passion for protecting these sites. And she developed a really good reputation for being a very strong, protector of those different locations. So she started as a plant ecologist. She always was a plant ecologist, but through the years, I think she sort of morphed into a really strong conservationist.
Lucy began promoting preservation and environmental education through other organizations as well, like the Wildflower Preservation Society of America.
E. Lucy Brown, with UC and other professors at UC, founded the Cincinnati Wildflower Preservation Society in April 1917 with 72 charter members. And through the years, they were up to over 700 members. And today, we're over 100 members, and a very active and strong organization.
The Cincinnati chapter started Wildflower Magazine, a vehicle that Brown used to educate and lobby for conservation. She wrote over 100 articles for the publication. Using the motto, "Enjoy, do not destroy," the group promoted adult outdoor education and taught conservation to children in area schools.
And at one time, they had 20 to 25,000 children. It was a huge impact. As I go through our archives and I look at their concerns and why they tried to protect what they did, I have the same concerns today. So you have the same pressures.
Lucy climbed in rank and gained tenure at UC in the 1920s. It was the busy life of a research scientist, teaching full-time, doing field research, writing and publishing papers, and participating in a variety of scientific member organizations. The area of E. Lucy's research quickly broadened beyond the Cincinnati region. In her brief biography, she notes an early interest in one area of southeastern Ohio.
In the 1920s, I became very interested in the Adams County, Ohio area near Mineral Springs and began an extensive study of soil and vegetation.
A carefully crafted photo album reveals more than a scientific interest in the area, opening with a description that speaks poetically to the beauty of the place.
Through quiet valleys of Ohio's hill country, between forest-clad hills and along tiny brooks, beneath lofty trees of wooded spaces, winds a road.
There was a very popular Mineral Springs resort south of Peebles, Ohio, and it lay in the center of a region of prairie remnants, which Lucy studied for her book, which eventually became The Vegetation of the Mineral Springs region. This is a very important reference guide to us today in managing the prairies of Adams County.
She would come by train from Cincinnati to a little town called Jaybird, which is up near the town of Peebles, about 20 miles from the preserve. She would then hire a buggy to take her down here, a 20-mile buggy ride.
Today, if we drive to let's say, a beautiful Cedar Glade in Adams County, it's easy to get there. You just drive there. Wasn't it easy back then, or in those early years when she was out botanizing the state of Ohio? Didn't slow her down a bit.
She brought her students out for field trips, not just for the day, but for weekends. And they stayed at a well-known resort not far where there were baths, because the spring waters were considered very helpful for people with rheumatism.
Now, the hotel had entertainment. There were dances. There were parties. There were games.
Students came out and they attend these dances. And I remember Lucy has said to her sister, I don't see how they could allow those young men to put their arms around them to dance like that.
Meg Riestenberg uses the vegetation of the Mineral Springs area of Adams County, Ohio, as a resource when bringing her students on field trips to the area.
Here I can go back to a text written by her, listing all the plants, telling me which bedrock I should expect to find, and that makes it a lot of fun.
Rick Gardner uses data from Lucy's study of prairies in Adams County to manage the same areas today.
Her data is like the bedrock or baseline for what this plant community type that we're trying to restore is all about. And if you look at any paper that's been done on xeric limestone prairies in other states and in Ohio, everybody references her work that was done in the 1920s.
After researching Lucy's materials, Martin McAllister was able to rediscover the area, an exact line of her transect, at Agave Ridge in Davis Memorial State Nature Preserve.
We've been restoring that site because after she sampled that in the 1920s, that site had basically gone through succession, became a woods, and our staff have been clearing that out, and the prairie is coming back, and a lot of the species that she recorded there are coming back, and it's very, very exciting.
It's challenging to gain insight into Lucy's private world, but a glimpse of her personal life exists in letters she wrote to her friend, colleague, and former student, Margaret Fulford, in 1930 and 31.
Dear Margaret, I have a few minutes now in which to start a letter to you. Classes are about as usual. I've never before felt so free as I do this year.
That sense of expanded freedom, despite such a busy teaching schedule, may have been due in part to an important change in the sisters' transportation options. In 1930, they acquired a car.
Annette and I went to Adams County a week ago. First, we went to Lynx and to some places south of there, left the car on 125 beside a barn. Then at 4 o'clock, we started for Fort Hill.
Later in the letter, Lucy mentions an invitation she received to attend a meeting and field trips of the Ohio Valley section of the Association of American Foresters.
I've decided to take it all in. I suppose I'll be the only woman, for the association is all men, of course. And the invitation came from one of the men on that Forest Service trip here, the one when they thought Dr. Brown was a man. I'm just wondering how the most of this gathering will take the invasion by a woman.
In a follow-up letter, Lucy confirms her suspicions about the gender makeup of the group.
When I went down from my room, I discovered that, except for one wife, I was the only woman in attendance. She left right after dinner. I stayed for the discussion of forest cover types. Love, Brownie.
In addition to revealing a softer side of Lucy, the letter provides a unique first-hand account of the challenges women faced in the male-dominated scientific communities. But obstacles didn't stop her. A few years later, she attained a leadership role at the Ohio Academy of Science.
One of the first that Lucy had, she was the first woman president of the Ohio Academy of Sciences. And this was back in 1933 to 1934. So that's actually pretty early.
A year later, she made her mark in the national arena as well by becoming the first woman officer of the Ecological Society of America.
She became the first woman officer as vice president in 1935. And when her book came out in 1950, was considered a significant enough contribution to propel her to be promoted for the presidency.
She really focused that organization on being open to women, and that organization has continued that legacy. When I was a young single mom in graduate school, the Ecological Society of America, they had childcare even 10 years ago. And that society has always been on the forefront of making sure that women felt included and women felt part of the society.
She was very assertive and strong and sure of herself. And by doing things that she did, she gained a grudging admiration from the other professionals.
I think she hurdled over all the men scientists, not just by her dogged determinist, but by her sheer excellence as a scientist. The males at the time didn't quite know how to deal with that.
She emerged from that powerful, and so did Annette. You know, Annette became vice chairman, I think, of the Entomological Society of America, the largest entomology scientific organization probably in the world.
Exploring the world beyond their doorstep started for the sisters at a young age, promoting a lifelong love of travel. Weekend jaunts during the school year and extended trips during summers provided opportunities for research and a welcome break from the demands of daily life. Frequent trips into the mountainous regions of Kentucky put them in regular contact with locals.
When these two women would come up and knock on the door of a house in a remote area in the hill country, the dogs would stop barking, and again, the men would put their shotguns away and say, oh, these two little women, what harm can they do, you know?
On one occasion, they traveled to the Natural Bridge area with Alice, a friend and one of Lucy's graduate students. Upon learning the hotel in the area was closed, they proceeded anyway, banking on possible accommodations suggested by an acquaintance from the Wildflower Preservation Society.
He told of a house to go to, so on faith we went, climbed around Natural Bridge till almost dark, and then started for Glencairn a mile down the tracks with all our duds. We were taken in at once. We slept 3 in one bed, though Mountain Hospitality offered us 2 rooms, but we figured the family needed some space.
After another day of hiking and another night with the family, they set out early the next day.
Planned to start for Cincinnati early Monday morning and got up before daylight to do it. Walked over 1 1/4 miles to the car and tried in vain to start it. We could not start. So Alice and Annette walked to Slade, 2 miles away to a garage.
The car finally started after a tow, and they were on their way. It was after dark by the time they reached Cincinnati. Lucy boasted to Margaret of her driving prowess.
Arrived home at 6:30, lights on for the first time. I'm getting to feel like an experienced driver, even went 38 miles per hour.
Here are two women. They are going into the hills and hollers. This is during the time of Prohibition, when moonshining was at its peak.
Robert Watts grew up in southeastern Kentucky and manages Lily Cornet Woods, a preserve in Letcher County, owned by Eastern Kentucky University. It includes 252 acres of old-growth forest.
It would be, in my opinion, very unusual to see two ladies out like that, strictly on their own. But it kind of proves, I guess, they were tough. They pursued a journey, and they wanted to see it through. So, yeah, I can see where both ladies were tough.
She was studying something that was quite rigorous, physically rigorous, and took a lot of physical strength and a lot of good communication skills, too. But in fact, she was able to cultivate relationships that helped her gain access to even better study sites and more insights into the habitats.
Lucy spent every summer between 1932 and 1938 doing extensive research in eastern Kentucky.
She came back here because she called this the Mother Forest. As simply described as possible, her idea was that during the last glacial period, the Wisconsinian glaciation, that this area in southeastern Kentucky, a little bit into Tennessee, which she coined the mixed mesophytic forest, was basically the refugia or the hangout for all of these species that had actually come to life before that glaciation.
Her work in Kentucky with the deciduous forest is legendary. I mean, again, people used to look at trees as something you cut down, you make money. And for someone, a botanist, to say, look at the grandeur of these forests. Look at the grandeur of these huge trees, the cathedral that they represent. That was sort of a new trend.
Exploration in the remote areas of Kentucky eventually brought Lucy to an area called Lynn Fork of Leatherwood. She wrote about her first visit in an article published in Nature magazine in 1936.
And then, ahead, rises the majestic column of the big poplar, straight, sound, and perfect, towering 80 feet to the first branch. In reverence and awe, we stood and gazed upon this tree, the largest living individual of its kind in North America.
By then, she was deep in the fight to save it. It wasn't just one tree at risk, but a stand of virgin forest that had only survived previous logging because of the rugged terrain. Lucy spoke passionately to garden club members in Lexington, urging them to help preserve what she determined to be the most remarkable patch of forest still in existence in the eastern United States.
Why not save a piece of your native country, your native state, in its original condition as a monument to the original beauty and grandeur of your forests?
Garden Club members, led by Daisy Hume, responded by starting the Save Kentucky's Primeval Forest League. Lucy lobbied for the establishment of national primeval monuments as a means of preserving for all time some of the few remaining areas of primeval vegetation. As part of her proposal, Lynn Fork of Leatherwood would become the first designated site. Following a massive letter-writing campaign in which she contacted influential environmental leaders from every state, Lucy traveled to Washington, D.C., and met with National Park Service representatives to plead their case. On February 28, 1936, she received endorsement of her idea from the Acting Secretary of the Interior, Charles West.
It is recommended by the National Park Service that this area be given national monument status if and when it can be secured and tendered as a donation to the federal government. Charles West.
If and when it can be secured proved to be a challenge. The success of the campaign hinged on raising funds for purchase of the property owned by a lumber company. but money to acquire the land was slow to come in. The following winter, Lucy received a phone call from Mr. Savage, a representative of the National Park Service, who just visited the Leatherwood site.
The lumber road's built all the way up Lynn Fork and now goes within a half-mile of the big tulip tree. There's a force of 22 men working, and it'll only take a couple more weeks to complete the logging road to the big tree.
After 2 years of persistent effort to save the forest, the news signaled defeat.
The Appalachian region is a place where there's been a long history of resource extraction, lots of pressure from logging and mining and other resources being taken out of the mountains, with little of the economic funds from those going directly to the mountain people, which is true with the resource extraction that occurs today.
There is a connection, just if you look at the timeline, between the work she was doing here in the Cumberlands, the loss of Leatherwood, and then the launching of this massive study that becomes her signature work, where she decides that she's going to document the entire North American forest before it's lost.
She worked really hard to preserve areas and they were still logged. But I think that's a great thing about Lucy, is she just kept trying. And I think that's a really important part of her story.
After the felling of the Leatherwood forest, Lucy picked herself up and went back to work. In 1943, she received a Guggenheim Fellowship to continue her studies of the ecology and taxonomy of the deciduous forest, work that would result in her most significant achievement. The sisters also moved that year from their family home in Walnut Hills to a 2.5-acre property in Mount Washington, a rural suburb of Cincinnati. They dubbed the new estate Brown Wood. DeVere Burt and his wife Pat are the property's current owners.
This room is where the sisters entertained. They didn't do it often, but when they did, there was always a slideshow of current work or of a recent trip. And they dined in a formal dining room in another part of the house, and then gathered in this room after dinner.
Lucy and Annette converted old servant quarters into a lab and developed an experimental garden where they grew many plants transported from the Appalachian region.
The Microlepidoptera hosts were there, and Lucy's plants were there that she was looking to identify and so on.
Helen Black met Lucy while trying to save a patch of woodland called Redbird Hollow, near her home in Indian Hill, Ohio.
They were very nice, showed me around the outdoors, particularly where they had brought all these rare plants from various states. And in a way, it was very useful, because if a certain flower was blooming in their garden, they'd say, oh, let's go out to Adams County. It's probably the week when the snow trillium will be blooming.
Hope Taft, former First Lady of the state of Ohio, learned of Lucy Brown and some of the plants she grew in her garden when she began planning for the Heritage Garden at the governor's residence in 2000.
I knew DeVere, and he invited us down to look at his grounds and what Lucy had brought there, and gave us starts of some of the plants that she had brought there from her work in the edge of Appalachia. So now when tours come through, I can talk about Lucy and her involvement in the conservation movement and the ecology movement and the legacy that she left the state in so many ways.
After more than 2 decades on faculty at the University of Cincinnati, E. Lucy Brown finally became a full professor of plant ecology in 1946. Lucy retired 2 years later at the age of 59 to pursue her research. The university awarded her the title Professor Emerita of Plant Ecology, a designation of significant achievement, one that was especially rare for a woman. In 1950, culminating her life's work in the field, Lucy published Deciduous Forests of Eastern North America, providing original theories and detailed documentation of trees all the way from Florida to Canada. The work was widely regarded as a monumental and groundbreaking achievement. Botanist Francis Fosberg said it reached a level of excellence seldom or never before attained in American ecology or vegetation science.
The book itself is actually an exhaustive, descriptive text. What it tries to do, what it does do incredibly well, is describe all of the major forest types, and she even says in the book that she is trying to describe them as they would have been, or as close to as they would have been in their undisturbed condition.
One of the values of Lucy's work is that she got to see the way the forest changed in light of the chestnut blight, which came in and killed all of the chestnut trees. So we can look at Lucy's work on how the forest changed after the chestnut blight and apply it to the forest changes that are happening today with other exotic pests and pathogens.
Lucy writes in the preface that she traveled 65,000 miles to acquire material for the book and dedicates it to Annette, who has shared the joys and hardships in the field.
Lucy probably would not have been able to do what she did at that tremendous scale if she had not had Annette, this field assistant that really, they were so compatible that they could work extremely efficiently. I think Annette also then adds this biological component, the flora-fauna relationship, that complemented very nicely Lucy's understanding of the geologic and floristic relationship.
I think Annette was extremely valuable, not only in collecting the data that she collected, but also doing the everyday things of cooking and cleaning and making sure that the house was kept together and those sorts of things.
Other books by E. Lucy Brown are equally well regarded.
The Woody Plants of Ohio was an amazing publication, tremendous amount of work. When she did that, she was also chair of the Ohio Flora Committee of the Academy of Science. So she sort of set the stage for expanding our botanical knowledge of the state of Ohio. And then later on, she put in print the monocots of Ohio, another marvelous book of all the various monocots, the grasses, the sedges, the orchids. These are difficult species to work with, but she tackled them, and she tackled them well. And those two books are still used today and are very valid.
A rift among scientists at the Ecological Society of America had widened for many years. Lucy Brown and other members of the ESA's Committee on the Preservation of Natural Conditions wanted to actively support conservation. Others felt the organization should have a strict focus on research and associated field studies. In 1946, the preservationists formed a new organization to address their concerns. They called it the Ecologists Union. In 1950, they changed the name to the Nature Conservancy.
Well, the Nature Conservancy has grown into a worldwide organization. We actually have projects going on in 70 countries around the world, in all 50 states. The Ohio chapter alone has been instrumental in helping to conserve nearly 60,000 acres in Ohio.
Lucy and Annette Brown joined with other biologists, naturalists, and nature lovers to form the Ohio chapter of the Nature Conservancy.
The Ohio chapter came along in 1958, and then in 1959, they decided to start their first project called the Lynx Prairie Project.
Lynx Prairie was one of the sites Lucy documented in The Vegetation of the Mineral Springs region, published 30 years earlier.
By 1959, she had convinced the newly formed Nature Conservancy to make that very property the very first acquisition. The Nature Conservancy in Ohio purchased 42 acres there.
Lynx Prairie was designated the E. Lucy Brown Preserve in her honor. Helen Black attended the dedication.
There were lots of professors and biologists of different kinds and interested garden club people. And I remember one friend happened to bring his bird dog out, and this very fast bird dog was apprehended by E. Lucy Brown. Said, "What, a dog? Take him away."
A team of like-minded individuals had worked with Lucy to make the purchase happen. Charles Hewlett, an Adams County resident and high school teacher, was one of them.
He was the person that went to the local farmers and said, this organization is interested in buying your farm. You have a lot of rare species of plant and animal, and conserving those is important.
Eric Race spent summers with Hewlett, his grandfather. Sometimes they went on group hikes. His memory of one hike at Lynx Prairie, led by Lucy, is particularly vivid.
She would ask a question about a particular plant, and I had the answer. And my grandfather, who walked with a cane, was pushing me to answer her. Go ahead and tell her what the answer. No, I'm too shy. I don't want to talk to this genius botanist. I think the third time, I just blurted it out. I said, Scirpus validus. And then Dr. Brown heard that and saw that it came from this little kid. She goes, mm-hmm. Well, anyway, this is a giant bulrush, and she went on about her business.
It was during that time that Richard and Lucille Durrell also became involved in preservation in Adams County. The Durrells had been students of Brown, and Richard was a geology professor at UC. He became a prominent figure for his work in environmental organizations in Cincinnati and across the state of Ohio.
The reality of it is, gee, all of a sudden people were like, yeah, that's part of our Ohio landscape. That's worth saving. That's really neat. She was a pioneer in making people become aware of places like that.
If she had not been on the forefront of that movement and coalesced interest in preserving natural areas, there's a good chance that we would not have any of those natural areas as parks or as preserves or especially conservation areas today. And that would be a great loss.
It's one thing to sit there and go, well, I'm going to conserve Yosemite or Yellowstone. But it's a different thing for someone to say, I'm going to conserve Lynx Prairie. Why do you want to do that? That's just, some old beaten down farmland in southern Ohio. Why would you want to do that? Because it's where north meets south and east meets west. It's where the plants come together. 4 geological time eras come together.
Buzzard Roost Rock is one of Adams County's most popular and iconic sites. In the spring of 1960, in what had become a familiar story to Lucy, the trees on Buzzard Roost Rock were about to be logged. Without action, it would go the way that so many forested sites in the area had gone before.
Originally, it's believed that Ohio was about 97% forest. By 1910 or so, that was down to about 11% forest. And now we're back up to roughly 34, 35% forest. So we've made a great comeback.
Logging is still a threat in many ways. We recently lost a wonderful forest that we were going to buy, the Nature Conservancy was going to buy, and somebody stepped in and offered more money, and they logged it, and they cleared amazing forest right in the middle of the preserve.
Buzzard Roost Rock became the second purchase of the Ohio chapter of the Nature Conservancy in 1960. Lynx Prairie and Buzzard Roost Rock were awarded National Natural Landmark status through the National Park Service in 1967. Lucy was 78 years old. She is credited for her leadership in the start of what is now the Richard and Lucille Durrell Edge of Appalachia Preserve System, jointly owned and operated by the Nature Conservancy and the Cincinnati Museum Center. Commonly called the Edge, it's considered one of the most successful privately funded preservation projects in the country.
The Edge of Appalachia Preserve is one of the most spectacular preserves in the eastern U.S. In fact, it's one of the largest private preserves in the eastern U.S. It's the largest Nature Conservancy preserve in Ohio, and we're now just shy of 20,000 acres.
4 of the preserves within the 11 that the Edge of Appalachia Preserve owns and manages are designated national natural landmarks. And basically those are defined as exceptional examples of the natural heritage of the United States. So Lucy Brown started this preserve. Conservation was in her heart, and we continue that today. I think Lucy would be absolutely thrilled to know that we started with her 28-acre purchase and now have built to some 19,416 acres.
Neither Lucy nor Annette ever married, allowing them to focus on their work and enjoy travel even late into life.
I do not know, of course, whether Lucy or her sister Annette had decided early on that they would never marry or if it was just what happened, but it certainly did free them up. It worked for them, didn't it?
Over the course of 81 years together, they'd traveled through most of the United States, making more than a dozen trips to the western states alone, and venturing into Canada several times as well. One of the things that DeVere and Pat Burt found hidden away in their home was a journal that Lucy wrote about a 1925 trip west.
Scientific writing is pretty cold, calculating, analytical, and precise, but the journals are lyrical, poetic, they're beautiful, and very emotive expressions of appreciation for the beauty of nature that they were seeing.
As older women, Lucy and Annette wrote letters to their friend Elizabeth Brockschlager almost daily while on the road. The letters reveal a more relaxed state of mind and an intimate sense of the pleasure the two shared in nature.
Even when you look at their travel notes from when they're vacationing, they're taking daily journals of what plants they see, and they're writing how many miles they hiked and at what elevation. They love this stuff.
E. Lucy Brown published her last major paper about Fort Hill State Memorial in Highland County, Ohio, in 1969. In 1970, she was still lobbying for preservation in Kentucky, fighting a dam at Red River Gorge. In Ohio, a year later, she led a group of National Park Service officials through Rocky Hollow and Shawnee Forest, advocating for its designation as a national natural landmark. Lucy died less than a year later, at age 81. Her legacy lives on in archives and herbaria around the country that treasure the Brown materials housed in their collections.
Lucy collected nearly 12,000 herbarium specimens, which are pressed preservations of the plants that she researched. And those are really valuable because they give a snapshot of how that plant looked at that period of time, when it was flowering. And that's really important to see how plants are changing over time due to climate change and other impacts that are occurring.
Annette sent Lucy's private herbarium to the Smithsonian Institute upon her death. Additional specimens are part of the Margaret H. Fulford Herbarium at the University of Cincinnati. Annette completed her last monograph in 1972 and donated her own collection of more than 30,000 Lepidoptera specimens to the Academy of Natural Sciences of Philadelphia. After suffering a broken hip, she entered a nursing home where she died in 1978, her entomology books beside her. The sisters are buried side by side near the low, spreading branches of the oldest oak tree in Cincinnati's Spring Grove Cemetery and Arboretum. Lucy's lifetime honors and awards are many. As the first female president of the Ohio Academy of Science and the first female president of the Ecological Society of America, she will always be recognized for breaking barriers as a woman of science.
She's a true trailblazer. She said, I don't know, am I a woman? I don't even notice. I'm just busy. I'm out here looking at plants and looking at the rocks. She just wanted to be a good scientist.
In recognition of her role in preservation, she became the first woman inducted into the Ohio Conservation Hall of Fame in 1971.
She contributes to a general ecological thinking, helping to educate a new generation of botanists and ecologists who themselves will become activists in that later environmental movement.
A great Otto Leopold quote is, "To keep every cog and wheel is the most important thing." And when you think about that, that means that the little tiny cog in that wheel has a value to the ecosystem. And Lucy looked at those little tiny cogs and saw the value of them.
She had a good eye for what was really important, what was unique, what was significant. And smart people said, okay, yeah, let's save it. And they did.
Looking at Lucy's work, you can see that she had a huge impact on areas of Kentucky and Ohio that are still being preserved today. And her impact many years ago continues.
The sites that she was studying in the 1920s, when conservation wasn't on anybody's mind, became nature preserves, and those grew into even larger areas. So single-handedly, she started an effort that's now resulted in literally thousands and thousands of acres being protected.
I think having known somebody like that, you admire what they have done and are glad to have known them.
Her legacy was, number one, as an academic, learn about it. Number two, as a nature lover, appreciate it. And number three, as a citizen, protect it.
She was a pioneer in preservation and conservation and ecology, and too often we forget the shoulders of the people who have come before us and that have added greatly to the knowledge of the natural world.
The rewards of knowing someone like that are great, and her influence on people in general, the legacy she has left is really profound. And now, generations removed from Lucy, we have an extraordinary conservation community, and I think that's the enduring part of her story.